That's what today's talk was about. Let's just revise a little. We spoke on Monday about the science of climate change. We looked at the evidence, the data. Yesterday we looked at possibilities of bringing this huge ocean tanker of motion, and remember that carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. Its residence time is around 50 years. So if we start reducing now, the real impact is only going to be felt in 50 years, and I'm not sure. There are certainly one or two of us who will be here in 50 years' time. But a lot of you shaking your heads and saying, thank goodness I'm not going to be here in 50 years' time. Well, you never know. If you think 20 years ago, or maybe 25 years ago, a cell phone didn't exist, and today every single one of you has it, and curses it sometimes, but praises it another time, you have to wonder what sort of technology will be around in 25 years' time. I'm still very sad there are no flying cars or jetpacks. That's really disappointing, because people would have said by 2020, definitely flying cars, definitely jetpacks. How can we adapt to a climate that looks like it's going to change? This is the scenario. I mean, it's just going to be a lot hotter. Now, someone once said, well, 1 degree, really, please, 1 degree, come off it. Well, I don't know how sensitive you are, but the human body can actually sense the difference between a shower that's 38 degrees and a shower that's 35 degrees and 36 degrees. We don't know what that determinant is. It's different, and you may know what your optimum temperature is. I know if the air conditioning in a building where I happen to be is set to 21, I'm perfectly comfortable. If it's set to 25, then I just feel warm. So that's my favorite temperature. But the difference between a very hot summer, and you just by recalling that summer and remembering a lot of hot days, and a regular summer is only 1 degree on average. So when we're talking about temperatures increasing 3 or 4 degrees, this has a very, very serious impact. And not just on the average, but on those peak days. And it's the one slide I forgot to put in, but we spoke about it yesterday, about those records in those different towns, where the maximum goes up by 4 degrees. And that's not because the global temperature has gone up by 4 degrees. The global temperature has risen by about 3/4 of a degree in the last 50 years. But those extremes are going up by 3 or 4 degrees. And that's the scary bit. And on our website, and there's a link to our website over there. If you go there, you'll find various scenario generators, and you can have a look. It's called CSAG. And if you have any problems, you just email me. Email me. My email address is at the back. I'd really love it if you emailed me and said, send me the details. I can do it. csag.uct.ac.za. And if you really, really want to, you can come and get a business card from me. All right, so there's rainfall issues, rainfall changes. The point is that it looks like there's going to be change. What kind of changes? Well, temperature, rainfall, extreme events, very hot days, heat waves, droughts, heavy rainfall, flooding, sea level rise, ecological zone shift, pest and disease shift, alien vegetation, fire. And that's not a complete list. That's not a complete list. There are others that are going to rear their ugly heads as we go along. Climate change, adapt or die. Now, that seems to contradict what I spoke about yesterday. And please, don't shrug your shoulders and do the old trick of, oh, we're all going to die anyway. I mean, we are all going to die, fact. Die and pay taxes. But we must make an effort to try and reduce this impact. I mean, I'm sure 90% of you got children, and some of those children may have grandchildren, and there's probably one person here who may even have a great-grandchild. That person is going to grow up in a different world. And we do not want to be the people responsible for making that world uninhabitable. Clem Santa, one of the guests here, has just written an article saying that's one of the red flags that's going up in our future. Will the world become inhospitable sooner than we expect because of climate change? And I think there are 4 red flags, are there, Mike? 5 red flags, that's one of them. So essentially life goes on, though, and we have adapted in the past. We will adapt in the future, because that is what the human specimen does. I mean, here is perfect evidence. I mean, you don't even have to be a scientist. Okay. Right, I'm not going to do a survey to see how many of each number we have there, but you know what I'm saying. And that's just the men's stuff. All right, so the question is, how do we adapt? What do we do? Where do we focus? Yes, ma'am.
Keep that slide on for another 1 second.
You want to take a photograph? Send it to your grandchild.
What's 2019 or 2020 then?
Yeah, 2019, it's like Beau Brummel, I'm afraid. Okay, so the question is how and where and what is actually happening, and this is where it gets seriously complicated. Every day I show you one seriously complicated slide. This is it. And you can see that everything is tied in there. There's climate, there's land cover, there's population, and I was begged by someone yesterday, and that reminds me I must ask you at the end about a poll. I also promised someone I'd do that. We're going to do a poll at the end. But I was begged by someone yesterday to focus on population because population growth, they feel, is the biggest issue that we're facing. And I'm not going to. Because it is a massive debate on its own. And this person was suggesting, the person's not here right now, was suggesting, for example, that the basic grant, child support grant, encourages people to have children. And research has shown that that is not true. In general, some places it is true. So we, South Africa, have got that little focus. Other countries have got another focus. I told you about the fertility rate in Uganda. There are many, many very complicated issues about population. And the bottom line is, if we all lived like Americans, there are just not enough resources to go around. So that's the essential truth about population, but I'm not going to get into that discussion. We are going to have to face population increase and development. There's going to be a need for water. I'll talk about this in Cape Town. And just an advertisement for Gina Zivugel, who's talking tomorrow and Friday on the water situation in Cape Town. I was very involved in that, and it's going to be a very interesting talk. So if you're interested, and you can still register for that, try and do that. So then there are interconnections, okay? There's a need for energy, and that energy is going to impact on the climate. There's more the climate changes, the more impact there is on water resources, the more impact there is on land cover change. What's going to happen to the land? What's going to happen to agriculture? The change of land use is going to happen, and then there's going to be changes of carbon dioxide, temperature, and water. So you see how complicated it is, and we have to unpack this and see, well, where do we need to adapt? The first point we need to look at is what is vulnerability? Who is vulnerable? Now, there's a headline in the newspaper here, and I just got, someone gave it to me, and you can't see it now, but it says, it's a picture of CR, Mr. Ramaphosa, saying that we've got to legalize the self-generation of power, Ramaphosa says. Okay, but just below that, there's an article about Woolworth's share price jumps 10% because they've replaced the chairman. Okay, now some of you are going, oh man, I just sold my Woolworths shares. Or some of you are going, oh, I've just bought Woolworths shares, fantastic. You become vulnerable to that change. I'm going to come back to the power generation later, but I just saw that example of Woolworths. You are vulnerable if you have Woolworths shares to that headline. Okay, so vulnerability is an exposure to an impact. You have Woolworths shares, you're exposed. Okay, and then the magnitude of the impact, 10 cents a share. Well, if you've got 1 million shares, woo, can we go out for lunch? Okay, well, you first got to sell those shares. But the point is, it's the magnitude. Then, less the capacity to adapt or cope. If you're saying, actually, I don't need that extra 10 cents right now, it's going to be a long-term view, then you're not really in a position to become as vulnerable as someone who doesn't have that capacity to put that off. And you know what you have to do with your pension fund. You have to change from a highly volatile portfolio to a more stable portfolio as you grow old. You're reducing your vulnerabilities. So if you understand the concept of vulnerability and you can unpack these, then we can do vulnerability studies. And we do these all the time. We're asked to do them. What is the vulnerability of the city? What's the vulnerability of the state? What's the vulnerability of the province? What's the vulnerability of a sector, an industry, a company? And then we have to unpack their exposure, the magnitude, and their capacity to adapt. So let's have a look at what we call critical thresholds. So there's a graph of Cape Town's maximum temperature over the last 100 years. Not even 100 years, it's an old graph. But you can see the maximum temperature has got a little step increase there. Minimum temperature has a constant increase. You can follow that line. What does that mean? Well, it means nothing if it just sits there. But it does mean something if you now interpret and say, well, you know, we've been operating in an envelope like this. All our activities have been designed to operate in that envelope. Okay? In that envelope. Now we suddenly find that envelope shifting, and activities that we're doing now are out of that envelope, out of that comfort zone, if you like. So now you become even more vulnerable. And this is how your vulnerability is going to increase. Okay, not because of anything you've done. So we have to recognize that. So we look at the impacts. Here's one, a really, really interesting one. Potential evaporation is projected to increase by 10 to 20. So what? If there's no water, it can't evaporate. Well, potential evaporation says if there is water, it's going to increase by 20%. So when you build a dam, and you build a dam like Teerwaterskloof, you are silly. Because the average depth of that dam is less than 20 meters. It's a massive dam, but it's very, very exposed to evaporation. But that wasn't their main consideration when they built it. Increased irrigation demands. Why are we going to be irrigating more? Because we need secure food supply. So that's a problem, okay? Soils are projected to become drier. Now, dry soil is not necessarily an issue unless you've got a crop in it, because you've got a dry soil that's drying more often, and that crop can only withstand a certain amount of drying before it flecks, which is really an Afrikaans word for die. Okay, and that plant dies, it's dead. Whereas if it's just dry for a day or two, you've seen it with your plants at home, it can be resuscitated. Land use changes, reduced crop yields, high irrigation demands. These are the implications. This is one on health. This is malaria. Current distribution of malaria mosquitoes, falciparum malaria, is in the yellow. Green is where it's going to become unsuitable for the malaria vector or parasite. So you can see some places, they're laughing there, okay? It's going to become unsuitable for malaria. The red is the areas where it's become suitable. Spot the red. Highly, highly densely populated areas in southern Africa. All right, look at that east coast of Australia. Malaria in Australia? Highly populated areas. So we're not even going to talk about that. Okay, and look at there, Middle East, these areas. That's where malaria may very well be prevalent. So we've got issues. Sea level rise. Whoa, it's complicated here a little, but we assume 1 meter sea rise. If the global warming exceeds 3 degrees, that's probably an exaggeration, but let's have a look. Projected loss of coastal wetlands. We know how important wetlands are. 90% projected loss of warm water coral reefs. Okay, we know that that's very, very sad. And you can see these hotspots, populated areas that are going to be threatened. Look at these ones here. Cape Town, that's probably Knysna, PE, Durban, okay, islands that are just maybe disappearing. There's the Maldives up there, all around Australia. So that's a threat. People are vulnerable. Who's vulnerable at climate change? Coastal regions. So the kind of adaptations you're looking at are agriculture, infrastructure, water, and health. These are the top 4, I reckon. And what's that going to require? Policy. You cannot implement change without policy. And the number of projects we've had with the city, with the province, and with the state on policy development, so many. So many. They want to find out where the vulnerability is, what's the exposure, what's the impact likely to be, what are the adaptations, and what laws and regulations need to be implemented to make those things possible. And for example, the city, Cape Town City, when we had the water restrictions. Water restriction 1, level 2, 3, level 4, level 5. That has to be promulgated. You can't just suck it out your thumb. It has to be discussed. It has to be planned. So planning, implementation, and regulation. That's what's required. So what is a natural response? What can nature do? And that's an interesting one, because we can't really change nature, and nature is going to have certain responses. Part of it is the way the ecological zones change, the way the ice caps are melting, the way that the permafrost is releasing methane. But here's a really, really sad example. Now, we all love this. This is Fred. He's a Hollywood actor. He dresses in a polar bear suit, and he poses for this picture, which you will find everywhere. Okay, it's not true about him, an actor. This is a real polar bear. But it's a really pathetic picture. What have polar bears got to do with global warming? It's about food. It's about food and survival. So if the ice goes, this is what happens. Now, how sad is that? That is the saddest picture I've seen in a while. I mean, that is just too terrible. This is in Russia, where polar bears have invaded cities to go and scavenge in the rubbish. So there are things we can do. This is something that the city did in conjunction with UCT. It was a study, in-depth study into the predicted impact of rising sea levels on the city's coastline, so to speak, coastal line development. Okay, that's an error there. But anyway, so the city wanted to look at the impact of sea level rise on the coast. Now, if you live in Bishop's Court, you're fine. If you live in Frederhoek, you're fine. If you live in Signal Hill, you're fine. As I said the other day, if you live in the Cape Flats, not so fine. But probably okay, there might be time to build a wall. But if you live in Muizenberg, it's a different story. If you live at Milnerton, it's a different story. This is outside the lighthouse is just behind here. There's Lagoon Beach Resort. This is that restaurant. And now this isn't necessarily because of sea level rise. There are issues with the harbor and the issues about erosion and wave power. But if sea level rise combines with those things, we are going to have serious issues. And these things are already being eaten away. So here's a picture of the peninsula, current sea levels, and you recognize this obviously. If we look at a scenario where sea level goes up by 15 meters, now that is a severely pessimistic scenario. This is the Greenland ice cap melting, remember that's on top of the land, and about a quarter of Antarctic melting, okay, with the whole west ice sheet. And you think we've had trouble renaming streets? Okay, yeah. I showed this to a school bunch one day, and the mother phoned me the next day and said, my kid can't sleep at night because she thinks we're going to be flooded. So I said, oh, geez, I'm sorry. Anyway, so adaptation, we also have this issue. Okay, the scientists are pretty clear. Guys, it's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen. This is where you're vulnerable, and this is what you're going to have to do, and you're going to have to do it soon. And the politician says, well, hang on a second. Hang on a second. Let's check the opinion polls. Let's check, how they're going to vote on this. Why do we still vote for a specific party who's in power and we're sitting with load shedding? Someone asked me the other day. Yeah, well, I don't know. Because there must be other reasons. We don't always do that. So adaptation is coping with impact. We need to find strategies to secure access to clean water, food security, energy security, protection from or preparedness for extreme events, include policy incentives, awareness, and then we have to really, really focus on food and agriculture, because if we can't feed the planet, we're in trouble. And feeding doesn't mean going to the supermarket. Okay, we need to look at the whole spectrum. So, agriculture, coping with impacts in agriculture. This is something I drew up for the grape industry. It's very complicated, but essentially there are some things that are affecting the grapes. These are the impacts. There's one in red which says growing population, increasing domestic demands for water. That affects their irrigation. And these are the impacts on the grape industry, and they have to deal with those. So every industry is busy doing this. I was up talking at a prune conference the other day. You didn't even know that prunes was what's a thing. And when last did you have a prune? It's a big thing, prunes. Okay, and pecan nuts, another big thing. These guys are really worried about the impacts of climate change. So a summary of agriculture is there's so many commercial farmers, they produce 70% of our food. There are specific impacts, especially on fruit, growing seasons, crop suitability, yield, quality. I spoke to a granadilla farmer up in the northern province, not granadilla, grapefruit, and he showed me a grapefruit, and he's got a little cap, a little plastic cap over this grapefruit to protect it from hail and sun. And he took the cap off and he said, now this grapefruit, I grow the perfect skin on this grapefruit for a European housewife to look at, to buy, and to throw away. I said, what do you mean? He says, because if that's got a black spot on it, or a yellow spot, or a pink spot, the housewife's going to immediately go to the other grapefruit and buy it. Are they going to eat the skin? No, no, no. So that's very, very important. Potentially, we've got a strong competitive agriculture industry. We are capable of exporting massive amounts of food, which we do. Okay, so currently, if you look at the net balance and you exclude imported anchovies and capers, because those are very specialized foods, then we manage on food. We actually have a balance there. Income earned from agriculture, you'd be surprised to see this, but the Western Cape has the highest income from agriculture. That is why it is such an important thing. That's why they go banging on about Western Cape agriculture. Horticulture is those arbitrary things like lettuce, spinach, fruit, flowers, wine. Did I mention wine? Okay. So that's very, very important. You can see our field crops, wheat and barley, are very low, and there you can see there's a lot of maize, which is the fruit crop. But agriculture is an important industry, so we focus on that. Impacts: increased evaporation, dry soils, heat stroke, sunburn, maize yield reduction, wheat yield reduction, high irrigation demand, pests and chill units. So I work with farmers on a weekly basis saying, how are we going to deal with this? What are our options? What are the things you can do? And we essentially look at a very, very dry year and we say, what did you do in that dry year that perhaps helped you just a little bit? And most of them will say, well, we didn't plant. And you go, well, that's not so stupid. Because if you plant, you've got to spend money. You've got to spend money on fertilizer, on seeds, on diesel, driving a tractor, on labor. And sometimes they say, we're just not going to plant. Or has happened in many areas this year, because the rainfall didn't come until very, very late in December, they're just not planting maize. You'll see the maize estimate for next year is very low. They're planting sunflowers instead, or soya instead, because they can cope with the later rainfall. So, agricultural adaptation, you can read my article in The Conversation. I wrote an article recently. The Conversation has got a lot of interesting articles. I'd recommend it. If you don't know about it, type in The Conversation. Enter. That's all you have to do. And these are some of the conclusions that I came to. Complicated stuff, but when it gets to agriculture and making food important. Reassess marginal crops. In other words, if your crop has had 6 years out of the last 10 where you didn't make any money, maybe you need to change your crop. Or at the very least, select appropriate seeds. We have short-growing seeds, medium-growing seeds, long-growing seeds. If you think you're going to have a drought, get a short-growing seed. Only needs a growing season in maybe 90 days, where the long-growing seeds is 120. The 120 will give you a higher yield, but the 90s give you a better chance of a yield. Diversify. Use conservation agricultural techniques, minimal or no-till, intercropping, cover cropping. We can spend another day talking about that. Reducing post-harvest losses. It is absolutely massive. Over 50% of Africa's food is lost post-harvest because there are no storage facilities, there's no refrigeration, there's no transport, and there's no access to markets. It's very, very sad. We're working on a very big project right now looking at that. Use the ecologically beneficial combination of crops and livestock. I get shot down by vegetarians saying you shouldn't be encouraging livestock, but there is a very, very close relationship with ecological land balance with the number of animals, whether they're being used to eat or not, the number of animals and the number of crops that are grown. There's a balance that can be done there that is very healthy for the environment and very healthy for the soil. It needs to be looked at carefully. And then access and learn about climate, which is why you're here. And when you go back to your wheat farm, you're going to apply all this information, aren't you? Do you have any farmers here? Ex, present, future? Yes, a few, okay? They're going to go back and change the world. Then we look at infrastructure. Infrastructure requires government or business intervention. You don't go around building roads. You don't go around installing sewers. You don't go around making bridges. Government will be doing that. So we have to look at the sustainability of roads, electricity supplies, may suggest novel solutions. I don't have to remind you about that. Maintenance. Oi, oi, oi. Exactly. Yeah. Access to credit is important. We need banks, we need various financial institutions to be able to finance these things. I've done another project on roads. And roads, if you have a dirt road going from Williston to Carnarvon, okay, I think that road is tarred now, so let's get another one. From Williston to Ceres is not tarred. Not Calvinia to Ceres. It's a terrible road. If you had 10,000 people driving on that road in a week, you would be wasting your money by maintaining that road. You'd have to go in there every time, fill up the potholes, clear it, grade it, whatever. Rather just tar it, because it's going to save you money in the long run. So there are various ways of looking at maintenance, and especially if you're in an area where it's going to rain so hard that the road's going to wash away if it's not tarred. So there are very interesting issues like that. Appropriate technology, we spoke a little bit about that yesterday. We're looking at advances. What about water? Oi, oi, oi. You think we'd be able to deal with this. It's not like it's the first drought that we've had. I remember very vividly in 1970, it was water year. I made a scrapbook on it, and it was all nice, and there was articles in the paper. And I've got a little cutting which says Cape Town has 57 days of water left. And we only had Steenbos and Wemmershoek then. So what did they do? Well, they built Theewaterskloof. They built Voelvlei. These all happened post-1970. So they did something. Now they've run out of space to buy dams, to build dams. So we had the hot day zero thing. And unfortunately, due to fantastic city planning and engineers getting involved, it was postponed. No, it rained. Okay, it rained. We were lucky that it rained. And that's the nice thing about rain, and that's the uncertainty about climate. It may rain. I told farmers in Lichtenberg in December, I said, you guys, the forecasts are saying that it's going to be dry in December, January, February. 3rd of February, it persistently rained in Lichtenberg. And they all want to know what's going on. Well, I said that was only one rainstorm. They've had quite a lot of rain now, but the rest of the Free State is still dry. The rest of the Karoo is still dry. So there are issues. The city has planned. The city has adapted. The city has said, guys, we've got a plan. Okay, first of all, the blue line is where we should have been using. That's the water amount we should have been using. The red line is what we're actually using, because they interfered here. They interfered by saying we are going to fix all the leaks. We were sitting at 27% of our water is being lost. Okay, the average in South Africa is 35, 40. We're now sitting at about 11%, which is comparable to any city in the world. And look at our water use. Okay, this only goes to 2014, but it got even less, and you can do the weekly maths from the city download. But they've said we're going to expand the input to fuel flow. We can look at aquifers. We can look at reusing. We can look at deeper aquifers. We can look at reusing, and then ultimately we might use desal. Why not use desal now? Because the case studies that have been shown around the world is that desal is a very, very risky investment. It's extremely expensive. It's got externalities in terms of salt and heat that need to go into the water. It requires electricity, which is already a problem. So it becomes one of the final solutions, if you like. And we will have desalination eventually. And small desalinators all up the west coast, right up into Namibia. You can see them. And it's happening. And also in Australia. Big desalination in Australia, only 2 of which are being used. Okay, the one in Perth and the one in Adelaide. Another alternative, interesting alternative, is clearing aliens. Now, this picture needs to be looked at in reverse, because this is what happens if aliens take over. You get runoff reduction of about 75% in between 20 to 40 years. We are now here. So if we can reverse this, which is hard, very, very hard to do, but if we can at least work on reversing this, then we should be able to have a lot more water in our rivers, and therefore in our dams. And remember, that water is slow seeping water. I've got a lovely slide of a picture of the Ceres Mountains covered in snow. It's from the archives. We don't see it much anymore. But that snow is like having a whole other reservoir, because when the snow melts, it doesn't all rush into the dam. It sinks into the ground, and it trickles through, trickles through, trickles through, trickles through. That's why you get springs on Table Mountain that are still flowing in the middle of summer, because that water trickles through, and it's a constant supply going into our dams, and this would be the same. So that's one thing we can do. There's a very interesting one. Go down to the Southern Ocean, 2,000 kilometers away, in a tugboat, and tow back an iceberg. Now, some people think this is completely ridiculous, but it's an adaptation that we seriously need to consider, because one of the things about this is the icebergs are there, the transportation exists. Okay, this is a guy that is belching a whole lot of carbon dioxide, so that's not a great idea. Someone's actually mentioning using kites, because the wind is coming from the southerly direction. And if we get it in the right band, it'll come along with a cold front, so we can just deliver the ice to our doorstep. But towing an iceberg, and you can see that's a massive amount of water, supply Cape Town with water for a whole summer. A whole summer. And you only order it when you need it. Now, this is FedEx. FedEx goes down there, picks it up, tows it back, parks it off Cape Columbine, where the continental shelf is deep enough and close enough to the shore, so you can park the iceberg there, and it's only about 20 kilometers, and then you get pools. You actually build a porta pool around this, because the cold water, once it melts, it's lighter than the seawater, and it floats on top, and then you pump it into tankers, you take it to the shore, and you pump it into the reticulation system. The only trouble is it's too clean, and it's too cold. But we can sort that out. So that's an interesting one. A friend of mine is involved in that. What the city's done is said, okay, regulation. Forget adaptation, regulation. Haal wet van die Transvaal, they say, wet van die Transvaal. Haal uit en betaal. So you guys are going to pay. So they yanked up the electricity rates, and you can see there, you had some free water, and now it would cost you 29 rand per kiloliter. If you were at step 6 and you used a ton, instead of paying 200 a kiloliter, you'd pay 912 a kiloliter. So essentially they said, well, during this period, what you're going to do is instead of using 500 liters a day, which is going to cost you around about 110 rand, you're now going to use 200 liters a day, which is going to cost you just a little bit more. Now, I checked our water bill the other day, and we are using exactly 200 liters a day in my house. And there are 4 of us, which I'm 400 liters a day. It's 100 liters each. This was the height of the restrictions when we were encouraged to use 50 liters a day. Now we're using 100 liters a day, and that's because of the hydro-illogical cycle. When it's drought, we cut down on our use. When there's water, when it's raining, when it's normal, we increase our use. Oh, we flush the toilet. Oh, come on, that smells not so nice. Flush the toilet. There's plenty of water. And that's very sad. So adaptation is something we can do, but then we lose sight of it. This is the compliance of the city during the years of the drought. You can see red is when people weren't saving water, and by 2018, there's hardly a red spot. We all did very well, because nobody wanted to queue for water. So is adaptation driven by desire, or is it driven by regulation? Carrot or stick is a good question. Let's have a look at an interesting thing that is slightly off track when it comes to water. And this is not going to please everybody, these following 3 slides. So if you are sensitive, then it's not sensitive. It's not going to make you sick. It's going to make you angry. This is a study that was done at UCT and through the city, consumption between Langa and Rondebosch over a year. Now, Langa is an established town. You could call it a township if you like, but it's an established town, established suburb. It's been there for 80, 90 years. There are houses there. It's not like shack dwellers or whatever. There are houses there. They exist. And the water usage in Langa is pretty much constant throughout the year, around about 400 liters per household. It's not that far off Rondebosch in July, August, September, and June. It's not far off. But all of a sudden in summer, the residents of Rondebosch get seriously thirsty. Why? They've got lovely green grass and swimming pools. Now, there's nothing essentially wrong with that. It just shows you that water usage in our city is skewed. And we were talking about developing infrastructure that's climate-proofed and that is ready to focus on a situation where we have less water. We haven't been able to solve this problem. Now, I'm not saying whose fault it is. I'm not saying who's to blame. I'm not saying anything. All I'm saying is, why do we have this problem in 2020? What makes us think we can solve the other problems? So we are going to have to learn to adapt. And in adapting, we must make sure we don't maladapt. Why are we still using flush toilets with water? Is there not another solution? Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But people may not want to use that. So that's tricky. But there's absolutely no reason why we can't have drainage, rubbish collection, and decent water supply. Anyway, positive news. We have all adapted already. Nobody runs the tap with their toothbrush under it anymore while they're brushing their teeth. Nobody does it. Nobody shaves like that. People have got gizmos. They've got things in their shower, in their bathroom. Hopefully you're doing something like that. Whether it's technological or whether it's manual, I don't know. But that's really, really the simplest possible thing you could do. Okay, you rig up a little tap there, and when you flush, water comes out there, you wash your hands, and the water goes into the cistern. What could be easier than that? How many of us have got that? Not many. Why not? Well, don't know. Let's ask a plumber. Business opportunity. You'd think. Now look at that one. Honey, I'm just going to the bathroom for a spin. Why not? What is so wrong with that? The vibration may even help to loosen the old, never mind. But the point is, where's that wastewater going anyway? Down the plug hole. Why? I mean, it's only going to smell nice. Bathroom smells like Omo. Beautiful. Are we doing this? Well, maybe not. That's what most of us have got. Jojo. Geez, imagine if we'd taken shares in Jojo. We'd be laughing. All right, so what about invasive organisms? Increased temperature and rainfall creates new bioclimatic regimes. Aliens are more suited to change. You're talking plants here. They displace edible natural felt types. They reduce biodiversity. They threaten water supplies, and they're a fire hazard. Here's a river that's been taken over completely in the background by water hyacinth. which is an invasive alien. Yeah, they clear it. Yeah, it does some stuff to the water, but essentially, it's making that water completely useless. Completely useless, and it's blocking our waterways. And we also got vegetation on the sides of rivers. I had a wonderful and a terrible experience during the holidays. I drove through the Prince Alfred Pass, which goes from close to Plettenberg Bay to Uniondale. Beautiful pass. Go up and down, up and down, up and down. Twisty, twisty, jagged. I'd love to do it on a motorbike. Absolutely beautiful. But it is just covered in Port Jackson and Blackwattle. Completely covered. And it's very, very sad to see that. Because it's a massive fire hazard. These things contain oils, they burn like crazy, and once they burn, they reseed. Doesn't sound like you claim to a climate lecture, because it isn't all about climate. It's about our total environment. Estimated invasion per tertiary catchment. These are the areas, and they're growing. Look at those reds. They are growing. Kruger National Park is up there. Aliens in the Kruger National Park, they're taking over. All right, let me talk about fire. And I don't have to talk about fire, but we are going to have one. Very sad. Australia's had bushfires. It's tragic. I mean, I haven't really been exposed. I haven't been there for a while. My wife was just there. She was in 2 cities. She says you can smell smoke all the time. Okay, because the smoke is just covering the whole landscape. Now, Scott Morrison says it's not climate change. But even Piers Morgan, if you know who he is, well, we agree on one thing. Because he said it probably is, because the scientists are saying it's getting hotter, and if you're a politician and saying it's not, then you're being silly. But the point is, what can we do about this? How can we adapt? Well, cut down the alien vegetation near your house. Move away from the edges of the natural areas. Watch out with thatch, things like that. Because this is the kind of devastation that results. It's not just you. All right, and that's very, very sad. Okay, that's not great news. Let's look at health. This is much nicer. Oh, no, disease preparedness. Early warning is critical, because if you have a disease outbreak and you know that you might have a disease outbreak, you can get fresh water, you can get the drugs, you can get the saline solutions, you can get the doctors 2 places in time. These are the diseases that are facing us. Dengue, you haven't even heard of dengue. Watch the space. It's coming. Malaria we've talked about. Rift Valley fever is coming. Cholera is linked to El Nino episodes of heating and warming and increased rainfall, especially in East Africa. Cholera epidemics, it's linked. Temperature control. Can we still keep our food chains valid? Can we keep our cold chain in our food? Are those trucks delivering fresh food? Can they still manage the increased temperatures? Big issue when it comes to fresh food from rural areas, keeping that food fresh. Cyclones, we know that they cause flooding. We see a cyclone, we can predict its path. I mean, they tried to evacuate Beira, but they couldn't. Okay, people didn't have the kind of transport that's needed. But if you know if it in advance, we can do things. Refuse removal. Well, think about it. Temperature in summer, 42 degrees. What do you think they're doing in Oudtshoorn now? Refuse gets collected once every week. Put out that meat, and you put out those vegetables, and you put those things into the bin with a couple of dog poos on a Monday. Refuse is only collected next Monday. By Friday, you've got a situation. You've got a situation. And imagine the people who don't have bins with lids on them. That's a problem. So we have to relook at that. Water purification is an issue. The hotter the water, the more difficult it is to purify, the more the organisms multiply. And then, of course, we have to look at food and nutritional security. It is much easier when there's a drought and a flood and food is scarce to go down to KFC and get a piece of chicken. $20 for a piece, I'm told. Okay? Want to grow your own vegetables? Good luck with that. So it's much easier. But nutritional security, that's not helping. Right, so I'm ending up now to talk to you about climate information, because I think that's quite important, and it's it's our business, but we do a lot of information, what we call climate services. We provide climate information to users. We call them users. There's things like short-term weather reports, and some of you know that I issue these things, and if you weren't interested, you can write to me, and I'll put you on the list. Medium-term seasonal forecasts, like what's going to happen next winter. I'll show you my scenario for next winter in a minute. long-term scenarios of what I've been talking Monday about, but ultimately combining scientific information with local indigenous experience and adaptation. So, speaking to people who live in Cape Town, in Higovale, who never get wind. Okay? Do you know anyone live in Higovale? Yeah. It's marvelous. You never get wind. You wake up in the morning, it's a beautiful day. You go to bed, beautiful night. You don't know what the wind's about. But what's the collateral? It gets hot. It gets hot up there. So that's indigenous knowledge. Whereas last night, I live in Fredhoek myself. I got home last night, it was 29 degrees. I've got the weather station, believe me. I had to play hockey in Rondebosch. I got to Rondebosch, it was 19. Different, it's literally 7 kilometers. Different climate. So indigenous knowledge and experience is important. Scientists can stand on a platform, and I'll show you some slides about that. And then what we do is create what-if early warning systems. So every time you identify vulnerability, you suggest, what if it gets hotter and wetter? What if it gets hotter and drier? What if it doesn't get hotter, but it gets wetter? What happens if it doesn't get hotter and it gets drier? And then people create these scenarios, and then they look at the historical evidence and say, well, it's more likely to be there or there or there, and then you can plan with some wisdom. You're not just throwing darts at a dartboard. Now, communicating scientific information. It's very important to talk about information. And here's a story. Goldilocks and the 3 bears. Now, some of you may know the story. But essentially, 3 bears live in a house, Mama Bear, Papa Bear, and Baby Bear, and they're carrying on their daily lives, and they make breakfast, and the porridge is too hot, and they go for a walk, and along comes this scamp called Goldilocks, and essentially, she trashes the place. Okay, she eats the porridge, she breaks the chair, she breaks the bed. Ultimately, she just cannot find things to be perfectly right for her. And that's why we talk about the Goldilocks planet, because our planet is perfectly right for human life. So that's the Goldilocks story. And she talks about porridge. And that's a really nice story, and you all remember it from your childhood if you were exposed to it. But when it comes to a scientist telling the story, this is what scientists do. And they will say, right, name, species, hair, fur, age, appetite level, size, preliminary porridge assessment, preliminary mattress assessment. Goldilocks, Papa Bear, Mama Bear, Baby Bear. And then they'll walk off the stage and leave you with that. That's not the story. What is just right preliminary porridge assessment tell you? Nothing. And scientists, unfortunately, very often are like that. Not the ones that teach at summer school, I hope. But this is a real slide from one of my professors. And he would stand up and say, and then go to the next slide. It's not telling you anything. And this is an official statement from the Weather Service. Read it and weep. The forecast for the remainder of the summer rainfall season suggests the persistence of an erratic rainfall pattern. Whoa! Okay, persistence of erratic. I don't know how that works. Over the central interior, enhanced probabilities of near normal. It's more likely to be normal. Over the northeastern regions, there's a significant chance of a continuation of sporadic. Really? All in all, this will do little to alleviate the drought. So basically, we're screwed. They could have just said that. So it's really, really important. And this is my seasonal forecast for you for the winter. All right, so this is the end of the talk. But there is always a big but, and I've alluded to it all through the 3 days. Climate change is an added stress factor to others, such as poverty, overpopulation, resource degradation, water shortages, the list goes on. The point is, have we dealt with these properly? And if we haven't dealt with these, how are we going to deal with that? And the real important lesson is, if we're going to deal with these without taking this into account, then we are really going to make our hole bigger and our problem worse. And this is the bottom line. This is what I subscribe to. Really, I do. Even if, Mr. Skeptic, we're up here and we're wasting our time, our career, our lives, our energy, and our money, surely we're making life, the planet, a better place. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and we'll have time for questions. that didn't do much for you guys. Hold on a second. I don't know how to do it. Right, so, questions? Yes.
Desertification.
Yes.
And a proposal that somebody counteract intensive overgrazing, control your thoughts.
Okay, so the question isn't really a question, but my thoughts on desertification and overgrazing. I don't know if you read David Biggs in the Argus, but he doesn't, I don't get the Argus anymore, but David Biggs wrote an article about going on his boat. He goes on the boat for a week and he takes just enough for his week. Okay, now every morning he wakes up and he has peanut butter on bread. He doesn't use all the peanut butter in the first day because he's got to make sure he has peanut butter by the last day. If you are going to put animals on a field, your carrying capacity is X. Why would you put X plus 50 on that field and then hope it's going to rain? Well, you would do that only under two circumstances. One is that you were pretty confident it was going to rain and that would be able to support that, or else you had no choice. Now, most of the places where we've got desertification is bad human planning. People do not plan it correctly. They put as many cattle or sheep or whatever onto the grazing areas, and when the rains suddenly fail, they're stuck. And what happens now is you've got the vegetation is being eaten. When the rains come, the soil washes away. There's no purchase for the grasses or for the crops. Not the crops, the shrubs. And you get what we call desertification. It's areas where more and more land is being exposed and less shrubs and grass are covering the surface. Now that, in turn, has an impact on the climate. And that's what my master's was about. My master's thesis was looking at desertification and the albedo, which is the reflection of solar energy. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but the more you reflect solar energy, the less chance there is of that energy being absorbed in the atmosphere and bringing rain. So there was a case of the reflectivity of soil that had been denuded was much higher, and this energy was going back into space, and we still don't understand the net results of that. But it's critical if we're going to look at sustainability in agriculture, and that's, I assume, what you're talking about, because the desertification is almost 100% due to overgrazing, then we need to manage those fields. And there are many people out. Alan Savory, go and read about Alan Savory. I mean, he's a fantastic South African, in fact, I think he's ex-Zimbabwean, but he's a scientist who's now working all over the world in looking at management of rangelands, which is essentially our savannas, how to prevent desertification. The second thing that's happening is because of the changing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and increased temperatures, grasses are giving way to shrubs and trees. And we're seeing our savanna being scattered more and more with trees, less palatable food for ungulates, which is our buck and our natural vegetation as well, natural wildlife as well as cows. So my view on desertification is it's very, very important to be sustainable in your management of that. Climate change is not going to help. But we have seen the Sahel, which is a typical example of desertification, the way it shifts. In the 1970s and 80s, there was massive desertification. It's recovered, because we don't exactly know on those margins how climate change is going to affect the rainfall. I don't know if that helps you a little bit with the question.
I really just wanted to hear your opinion of Alan Savory's.
Okay, well, there I gave exactly, read your mind. I must just, before I forget, remind me to do the poll. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just have your thoughts on, I saw a headline the other day, I think it was in The Guardian, I didn't read the whole article, but it said that there will be an end to agriculture because so much of our food will be coming out of laboratories, and that's already happening. What are your thoughts on that? And then the second thing is, how would you define overpopulation against the background of the unequal distribution of wealth and resources?
Yo, that's a high-grade question. Let's go back to the easy one. I haven't eaten anything from a laboratory in the last week. Okay? As far as I know, I haven't eaten anything from a laboratory. Okay, I've had one piece of meat that was on Sunday, looked pretty genuine. But so far, I don't think I've eaten anything from laboratories. I'm not sure when you're saying it's become more and more popular. I think if I was a scientist working in that field, man, this is exciting. We can make food without going through the input costs, without going through to worry about the rain, the investment, the land. We can just all do it in the lab. If it's got the same nutritional value and it's been proven, really don't have a problem with that. I can't see that I've got a problem with that. Maybe they'll come up, but maybe there are alternative ways of growing food. Maybe there are, and I'm not going to knock it because I don't know enough about it. When it comes to overpopulation, the definition of overpopulation means that the resources and land, including land, the resources are not enough to support that population at a desirable level. Now, that desirable level is far less than you and I desire. I mean, we are serious over-consumers. Think of just how many shirts you've got in the cupboard. I went to a talk about 3 months ago in Australia, and the guy said, climate change, buy less clothing. Huh? He says, every piece of clothing he requires uses more water than you will use to wash that piece of clothing in its life, just to make that piece of clothing. And all of a sudden you start thinking about it, and you think, well, hang on a second, that's the problem. We live in ignorance because it's designed that way to sell us more stuff. We don't get the full story when we buy stuff. So resources at desirable level is a very, very tricky one. I mean, I've got plenty of friends who live off the grid, who use very few resources, wear the same clothes, smell the same way. Okay, I'm kidding about that. But I mean, use a lot less. And if everybody used that amount, we could have another billion people without a problem. But if we're all aspiring to a certain level of the average Western person who can just walk into a whatever food shop you want to call it and just pick stuff off the shelf that comes from all over the world and expect that to be normal, that is never going to happen. I mean, you just have to go to Southeast Asia and see how many millions of people in India, Philippines, China are really just living off the land. So difficult, very, very difficult question. I don't know how one deals with overpopulation, but overpopulation is very much in the eyes of the person who's looking at that desirable level. If everyone in South Africa had a car, for example, it'd be fantastic, but don't expect to be able to go anywhere.
I just think that one of the problems that I have with the putting part of the blame on overpopulation is the fact that we can sit and say population. I mean, I think every South African, even white South African, is overpopulation. And in America, they can say, because we can say it's their fault.
Or I can afford to have 10 children. No, absolutely. And I'm not going to try and answer that. Sorry. Anyone else want to try and answer that? Gentleman at the back, please, can you give? No, he doesn't want to answer it. I'm just kidding you. Yes.
Can I suggest something? Try reading Hans Rosling's Factfulness.
What's it called?
Factfulness.
Factfulness. Hans Rosling. I haven't read it. So that would be nice. Factfulness. This lady's going to buy us all copies. I'm sure it's in the UCT library. Right, question, sir.
Yeah, just to pick up on his comment about safety.
Yes.
I'd like to hear your comment on grasslands and their function as a carbon sink. And then from there, the fact that you put beef into a single category where you should perhaps be separating beef produced from feed stalls and grassland beef.
Yeah, it's also a complicated question. The grasslands are an ecology in themselves. Grass grows better if it is grazed, if it's fertilized, if it's in some sort of balance with the environment. I mean, that's why the savannas of old had thousands of wildebeest. But the wildebeest didn't sit there. They migrated backwards and forwards. And that was to do with the cycles, the rainfall cycles. So that vegetation was healthy. The wildebeest came back. They didn't look, oh, shucks, what's happened? It was there. That was the natural cycle. So if you're going to put beef and cattle out onto a field, you've got to try and mimic what nature requires. Now we have things called feedlots, where they put all the cattle in a place like this and say, they don't need grass, they don't need exercise, they don't need anything. Just feed them and kill them. That's what a feedlot does. Carrion beef, you go to the waterfront. I had such a fight with a restaurant manager. Everywhere you go, say, we only stock carrion beef. That is a negative. Carrion is the biggest feedlot in the country. Go and type in carrion beef and look at their conservation. They've got 3 springbok out in the field. That's their conservation ethic. I mean, Karen beef is a feedlot. It's bad. So this gentleman is suggesting, well, maybe you should have an option of buying grass-fed. By all means, go down to Garden Centre, and there's the butcher at the top, only grass-fed. Piece of steak, 280 Rand a kilogram. Normal steak done at Pick and Pay, I don't know, 120, 130 Rand a kilogram. So there's a differential. It is happening. Unfortunate thing is, if we didn't have the feedlots, we would not all be able to eat the kind of meat and the amount of meat that we eat. If you just had to take America's meat consumption, they need to take over the entire North America continent, the entire South American continent, and half of Africa to graze their meat on grasses.